In this video, I want to turn to a little bit of literature, great literature, perhaps the greatest of all, William Shakespeare, who needs no introduction. I want to look a little bit on Shakespeare and hypocrisy, and I'm picking up on and following Brian Vickers' classic article, Shakespeare's Hypocrites. And this article is broken up into about 5 sections. I'll cover the first one today and try and get a few more in later videos. The one today is a little bit of an intro, and we'll talk a little bit about measure for measure. Great play. The other videos will deal with some of the other aspects. There's a broader discussion in the second part of the essay, and then there are more dives into Macbeth, Othello, and King Lear. So that's for another time. Today I'm just doing this little bit here. All right, let's look a little bit at how we can think of hypocrisy. We've been looking at it in a variety of ways. And here's one approach to it before we get into the literary angle of it, which literature, great literature is always really dealing with character development. So let's think about hypocrisy in two ways. One is a kind of static structure and the other as a dynamic one in terms of development. So the static one is a kind of a backward looking kind of thing where, X as a subject, a person, X kind of scrolls through the memory of X's actions and says, "Oh, I'm bad. I'm a bad person," right? But X not only has these memories and makes this judgment about himself. X also desires, I don't want to look that way to everybody, even if I am. So it's that contrast, but it's a contrast that it's predicated on, basically a backward looking. I look over my past. And now what am I going to do to satisfy my desires to appear as good? I'm going to engage in dissimulation, which, as we talked about in our Aquinas video, head over there if you aren't familiar with Aquinas. But dissimulation was some way, it's a kind of lie to get people to think that the inside of you is the contrary other than what it actually is. So in this sense, and of course this would be sinful because it's a lie. And so you've got a covering performance, kind of like a tarp, right? Oh, I want people to think I'm good, so here's a list of things I'm going to always do to cover up who I am and simulate who I am not, right? So dissimulate is going to be covering up and getting people to think something different, the contrary. And it hides the inside, right? So this covering performance. Well, if we just want to make this a little bit more dynamic, rather than thinking of the covering performance as just kind of this tarp, this set of things that are done, we can think of it as a kind of method by which, it's my method by which I figure out other ways and new ways of behaving. I don't just have a set list. I can react to the situation, and instead of a tarp, it's actually a practice or a method by which I can cover up my wicked ways and still be moving directly towards, or indirectly as the case may be, towards my self-serving goal, right? So I'm trying out new ways to get to my self-serving goal as opposed to just having a simple stock set of behavior patterns to hide myself. So it's a more dynamic, more involved one. All right. And this method is usually, something consciously adopted, but not necessarily so. And Shakespeare always likes to explore ambiguities, right, about people. He always thinks people they're multifaceted. They're driven by all kinds of things, their rationality, their desires, and all that. And we have to just take them like that. They're complicated objects. And in many ways, that resembles what Aristotle says. We are complex entities. We have reason, we have passions, and the passions are there, and they're difficult to control. And Aristotle doesn't really think you can absolutely control them. He says very explicitly, like in the Nicomachean Ethics, they're kind of like little kids, and you can't really completely control them unless you just sort of get rid of them. But you don't want to do that, because life and pleasure involves the emotions and things like that. So you want to control them like you control little kids. You kind of got to get buy-in and keep them. They can sometimes get their way, but they shouldn't run the show. All right. Now, let's have a look at a little bit of measure for measure. Well, this is an extremely brief overview of a fascinating and complicated play, but it basically takes place where the question of leadership and judging, and the hypocrisy that can crop in to judging when desires are involved. So it is that, desires coming in and mucking things up. So it starts off with this Angelo guy, a main figure in the play. He's kind of like Spock, right? Kind of like Spock. And in what way? Well, he's a Spock-like guy in that he's like Spock, actually, where Spock has a beard in that one. I'll forget about that. But anyways, he's sort of this stern ruler, this emotionless guy, and he's sort of kind of cruel but fair, I guess, in a way. He's cruel to everybody. He's very stern, and he's ruling Vienna in the Duke's absence. And some of his enemies say he feels no wanton stings of sense, right? It just that stuff doesn't bother him. He just goes about kind of like a machine, kind of like Spock. Again, Spock with a beard. And he judges, in one of his judgments, he judges this Claudio guy, and afterwards gives a stern judgment, and he's fine with it. He doesn't really think about it, doesn't bother him. He's just, kind of like a hanging judge kind of guy. However, Claudio has a sister, Isabella, and she comes to plead her brother's case to Angelo and says, hey, take it easy on him, right? That was a really harsh judgment. Now, what happens? Well, as Shakespeare is prone to do, this character is a very attractive human being, to say the least, and it's just her presence stirs Angelo's desire, so it starts to upset everything, right? So he now is like, oh wow, and starts to think, lewd thoughts, and then Shakespeare drops this quite an arresting image of the sunshine. When the sun shines, it can produce flowers, but like with a dead animal, it's going to produce rot, right? So the nice sort of sunshine can have very different effects depending on what it starts with. So that gives us a way to think about what this, I called him a Spock guy, but what else is under there, right? Does this, Isabella walking in, arousing the desires, but if we think about it through this imagery, right, is it something that's dead to begin with, right? Because the sun doesn't cause flowers to rot, right? It causes the seeds and all that to grow, and something beautiful comes out of it. So it depends on what you start with when you shine the sun on it. All right, so he makes this lewd proposal, and needless to say, she's not too happy about that. And he says, well, if you exchange for these favors, maybe I'll go easy on your brother. And she says, look, I'm going to denounce you for this. I'm not putting up with this. I'm going to tell everybody who you are and what you did. And he's like, position of power. He's like, what? I've got this austere record. You look at my past. I've got this austere record. No problems there. Everybody knows, like, I'm, straight kind of guy, very austere. Doesn't seem to deviate in any way. This, implying that this is something new. He's not denying anything. What he's saying is that in the court of public opinion, I've got rank, I've got this record, I've got all these things. What do you got? And in the end, he says to her, yeah, go ahead. Say what you can. My false, rather icy sort of statement, my false overweighs your true, right? It's not going to matter. People are going to believe me and not you. All right. So that kind of gets the whole thing rolling, and it is a dynamic notion of well, it seems like, Angelo was something. I mean, he wasn't exactly a great guy and all that, but him becoming a hypocrite is something comes into his life, and again, keep this image in mind, because Shakespeare is trying to say how complicated things are, but they're not just simply it's her who causes it, but it's her presence and something in him that together becomes this, leads to this lewd proposition. That's one way to read it. There are probably lots of other ways, of course. It's Shakespeare. You can read it in different ways. But it's a dynamic notion and not a simple one. Okay, so the Duke, who was the real kind of leader in the city, he's not around right now. Remember, Angelo was the deputy judge that's ruling in his absence. But the Duke comes back, and again, Shakespeare's always got these, complex things. He's working in the background with Isabella, who doesn't know who the Duke really is, because the Duke is disguised as a friar. So there is through these twists and turns, he gets it where, working with Isabella, he gets it such that he preserves justice, right? He saves Isabella, preserves all this justice and all that, while Angelo is thinking that he's getting what he wants, right? So there's a swap out. Instead of Isabella, that Angelo sleeps with, it's actually someone else. It turns anyway. So it's this complicated story, but Angelo thinks he's getting all this stuff. He thinks he's actually acting on his intentions, and so that's a bad thing, right? Because he thinks he's doing all this stuff, and but he's not actually doing it. What he thinks he's doing. Isabella is working with the Duke, or working with the friar, which doesn't know he's the Duke. And then we come to the final scene. It's kind of like a court scene, and like Angelo predicted, my thoughts will overweigh your true. She says these things, and she doesn't realize that the Duke standing in front of her, of course, was the friar. But eventually, she's like, ugh. And then the Duke behaves like Angelo predicted. He's going to say, well, look, I got to go with Angelo. He's the guy, right? He's got all the standing, and she gets into legal jeopardy here. And then eventually the Duke exposes Angelo. He says, oh, okay, enough's enough. I know you are. I know what you've done. And he exposes him for what he is. And Angelo just crumbles, right? He just, I look at me. I'm an awful person. I look at you, my lord, and I just give up. Right? I just crater. And when he asks to be punished in a couple of times, like capital punishment, he asks for it a couple of times, and he just craters. And in this sense, Isabella then says, well, she kind of comes sort of to the defense. He didn't really. Like his actions really weren't real. They didn't truly correspond to his intentions, because he didn't do he didn't manage to take advantage of me, because there was a swap out, right? Typical in Shakespeare, people are always, misinterpreting what's going on around him. So she says it wasn't actually me. So he didn't actually act on his intentions against me. So maybe it's, maybe we should go a little bit easy on him. He's a bad guy, he's a liar and all that, but not maybe as bad as if he'd actually done the things. And the Duke says, that's certainly the case. And Angelo has certainly been punished. He's been punished by being publicly humiliated, right? That all this stuff, his intentions, while he didn't actually secure them, his intentions have been exposed. And he's exposed as the villain that he is. Right, but he's not a villain who was actually successful, right? He was the unsuccessful villain. I mean, there's always weird stuff in Shakespeare. You're not sure exactly what he's trying to say. And that's the thing, always beware. Never clear what side Shakespeare's on, because he's kind of all over the place. So what he really thought, I don't know. But anyways, and then the Duke makes some reflections. Okay, well, Angelo has been seriously punished. This counters his terrible intent, right? This public humiliation. And then he says, kind of back in what we've seen in our things about Dante and the contrast, and also in Matthew, the contrast between the inner and the outer. And, like what man within him may hide, when he is, though angel on the outward side, right? What you can hide in here, though you seem like an angel on the outward side. But again, the Duke then says, sort of to wrap things up and tie it up in a little bow, he says, well, look, I wasn't being honest either, because remember, he was acting as being the friar, right, in order to thwart Angelo's plan. The Duke had to use some cunning and some skill and basically at lying and making things and engaging in falsities. And he said, craft against vice I must apply. So there you go. There's a little bit of Shakespeare dealing with the hypocrite, sort of the creation of one, I don't know, I guess the rise and the fall of a hypocrite, showing us that this is sort of a dynamic kind of notion. But in the end, Angelo, the dynamic hypocrite, he gets his comeuppance through this act of public humiliation, and ultimately doesn't get what he thought he wanted anyways, and And there's sort of a justification of using some kind of lies and deceit, right, which is a sin, but it can be not so bad, as we saw with Aquinas, if it's directed against a vice against vice, so to speak. Typically difficult to interpret, but hey, that's Shakespeare. All right, so that's it for this video. I'll see you next videos when I'm looking at some other aspects of Shakespeare. A lot more to come.